The silence of the mountain was a heavy blanket, smothered by snow that had fallen for 3 days without pause, and now lay deep and unforgiving. It clung to the sagging roof of Gunner's barn, filled the deep gouges in the mud of the corral, and muffled the sound of his own labored breathing. Inside the cabin, the fire was a sullen orange eye in the gloom, consuming the last of the split pine with a reluctant hiss. Every log he burned was a choice, a calculation against the coming weeks. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that had already slipped past his defenses and into the barn, where it was slowly stealing the life from his horses. He could feel the ranch dying around him, the legacy of his father turning to frost and bone under his watch. He was a huge man, built of the same rock and timber as his claim, with a cascade of tangled brown hair and a beard that fell to his chest. But he felt brittle, hollowed out by failure. The sickness had taken 2 mares already, and the big stud Titan was now refusing grain, his great head hanging low, his breath a ragged plume in the frigid air. The bank in town didn't care about blizzards or equine fevers. They cared about the note he'd signed, the numbers on a ledger that grew more menacing with each passing day. His last desperate act had been to send a letter and a sum of money he couldn't afford to a broker in San Francisco. A wife. He hadn't thought about what kind of woman would answer such an advertisement, only that the isolation was becoming as corrosive as the debt. He needed help, another pair of hands, another soul to stand against the crushing quiet. He expected someone sturdy, plain-faced, and desperate as he was. Today was the day the mail carrier had promised to bring her up the pass, weather permitting. Gunner stood at the cabin's single window, his breath fogging the glass, and stared at the trail. It was a fool's hope, another gamble on a losing streak. And then he saw it. A small, dark figure moving against the vast, unrelenting white. And as it drew closer, a flash of impossible color, a pale, delicate pink. The mail carrier, a man named Henderson, whose face was lost in a thicket of ice-caked wool, helped her from the sleigh. He looked at Gunner with a mixture of pity and grim amusement. "This is her," Henderson grunted, gesturing with a mittened hand before climbing back onto his seat, eager to be gone. "Good luck to you." He didn't wait for a reply, the sleigh bells fading into the oppressive quiet of the snow-filled valley. She stood alone, a small, straight-backed figure in a land of brutal scale. The dress was absurd. A light pink prairie dress, its fabric thin and completely unsuited for the savage mountain winter, the hem already damp and dark with melted snow. She clutched a single, small wooden trunk. Her face was pale, her dark hair pulled back in a severe knot, but her eyes, when she lifted them to meet his, were unnervingly direct. They took in his immense frame, the wildness of his hair and beard, the grim set of his jaw, and showed no fear. Only assessment. This was not the stout, work-worn woman he had pictured. This was something else entirely, something fragile and foreign. "You are Gunner?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried with perfect clarity in the still, cold air. The name sounded strange on her tongue. He gave a curt nod, his disappointment a sour taste in his mouth. He had wasted his money. This woman would be broken by this place within a week. "I am Li Wei," she said, offering the name as if it were a formal credential. He didn't respond, just gestured towards the cabin. "Inside. It's cold." He turned his back on her and strode toward the door, not bothering to see if she followed or to help with her trunk. The transaction felt like a swindle. Inside, the meager fire did little to dispel the chill. He watched as she placed her trunk carefully by the wall and stood in the center of the room, her gaze sweeping over the sparse furnishings, the unwashed skillet on the stove, the general air of neglect. Her eyes were missing nothing. A low, guttural cough echoed from the direction of the barn. Li Wei's head snapped toward the sound, her posture instantly changing. The stillness was gone, replaced by an alert, focused intensity. "A horse?" she asked, her gaze sharp, pinning him. "It is sick." Gunner scowled, annoyed by her perception. "They're all sick, and there's nothing to be done for it." He expected her to retreat, to show some feminine dismay at the harsh reality of her new life. Instead, Leeway walked to the cabin door and pulled it open, looking toward the barn, a structure that seemed to groan under the weight of the snow. "Show me," she commanded. It was not a request. The tone was level, devoid of emotion, but carried an authority that caught him off guard. He bristled. "There's nothing for you to see, nothing you can do." "You do not know what I can do," she replied, her eyes still fixed on the barn. She looked back at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something other than calm assessment in her dark eyes. It was impatience. Impatience with him, with his resignation. A long, tense moment passed between them, the only sound the sighing of the wind around the cabin's eaves. He was bigger, stronger, the master of this failing domain. Yet he felt strangely compelled to obey. Maybe it was the futility of arguing. Maybe it was a sliver of curiosity. Or maybe it was just that he had no other ideas left. With a grunt of frustration, he grabbed his heavy coat from its peg. "Fine. Come see the ruin you've married into." He led the way, his heavy boots punching deep holes in the snow. She followed behind, her smaller steps surprisingly steady, her absurd pink dress a stark banner of defiance against the monochrome landscape. The air inside the barn was thick with the smell of sickness and cold straw. In the dim light filtering through a single dirty window, the horses stood as listless shadows. Titan, his magnificent black stallion, didn't even lift his head. His breath came in shallow, wheezing gasps. Leeway moved past Gunner without a word. She set down the small satchel she had retrieved from her trunk and approached the stallion's stall. She did not touch him at first. She simply watched, her eyes narrowed, observing his breathing, the slight tremor in his flanks, the dullness of his coat. She was utterly focused, the harsh surroundings seeming to fall away. Then, with a quiet murmur in a language he didn't understand, she unlatched the stall door and slipped inside. Titan shuddered but didn't move away as her small, slender hands began to move over him, pressing gently along his neck, his ribs, his legs, her touch both firm and diagnostic. Gunner stood by the entrance, a silent, massive observer, his skepticism warring with a nascent flicker of awe. He had expected tears or fear. He had received a clinical, unflinching examination. She spent nearly an hour in the barn, moving from Titan to the other ailing horses, her movements economical and precise. She ignored Gunner completely, absorbed in her work. When she finally emerged from the last stall, her expression was grim but focused. She walked over to the workbench where he stood, leaning against the rough-hewn timber, arms crossed over his chest. "The feed is wrong," she stated, wiping her hands on a piece of burlap. "It is damp. There is mold." He opened his mouth to argue, to say it was all he had, but she cut him off. "And there is not enough clean water. The trough is freezing over. They are dehydrated. It makes the fever worse." She spoke in simple, declarative sentences, laying out his failures without accusation, treating them as data points in a larger problem. He felt a surge of defensive anger. "I'm doing the best I can," he growled. "Your best is not good enough for them," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "They will die if things do not change today." She walked back to her small satchel and opened it. Inside were not the things he would have expected a woman to carry. There were small, cloth-wrapped packets, glass vials filled with dark liquids, and a set of long, slender needles. She selected several packets. "Boil water, a large pot, as hot as you can make it," she instructed, not looking at him, "and bring me fresh hay from the highest part of the loft, the driest you can find." The sheer audacity of her commands, of this small stranger in a pink dress ordering him about in his own barn, was staggering. Yet, there was a core of undeniable competence in her actions that silenced his protests. He had been fighting the sickness with desperation and ignorance. She was confronting it with a plan. For the first time in months, someone was looking at his dying enterprise not as a tragedy, but as a system that could be fixed. Grumbling under his breath, Gunnar turned and went to do as he was told. He hauled water from the well, his muscles straining against the frozen pump handle, and stoked the fire in the cabin stove until it roared. He climbed into the loft, pitching down the driest bales from the back, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of afternoon light. He worked with a renewed, if reluctant, energy. When he brought the steaming pot of water to the barn, she had already cleaned a space on the workbench. She was grinding herbs with a stone, the sharp medicinal scent cutting through the stale air. She didn't thank him. She simply took the pot and began to steep the herbs, her movements fluid and certain. They worked through the rest of the day and into the night, a strange and silent partnership. He did the heavy lifting, hauling water, clearing soiled bedding, breaking the ice in the troughs. She performed the intricate work, mixing poultices, forcing tinctures down the horses' throats, speaking to them in that same low, calming tone. He watched her hands, surprisingly strong, as she massaged a horse's cramping leg. He watched her face, illuminated by the flickering lantern light, set in a mask of intense concentration. He had paid for a wife, a companion to ease his burden. He had received a commander, a physician, a strategist, who had, in the space of a few hours, completely taken charge of his last-ditch battle for survival. By the time they finally stumbled back to the cabin, exhaustion was a leaden weight in his limbs. She had prepared a thin broth, and they ate in silence, the unspoken questions hanging in the air between them. Before retreating to the small cot he'd set up for her, she paused. "Tomorrow we build a new fence line," she said, "to separate the sickest one. And you will show me where the willow bark grows." He just stared at her, then gave a slow, weary nod. The mountain winter still pressed in from all sides, but for the first time, it felt as though someone else was pushing back. The blizzard struck without warning 3 weeks later, a maelstrom of wind and blinding snow that descended from the peaks and swallowed the valley whole. They had fallen into a grueling rhythm, a life stripped down to the essentials of survival. Every waking hour was dedicated to the horses. Under Leeway's relentless direction, Gunnar had built the quarantine pen, dug a deeper drainage trench around the barn, and spent days chopping through frozen ground to clear a spring-fed channel to the water trough. He worked harder than he ever had, his massive frame fueled by the thin, savory broth she made, and a growing, grudging respect. He watched as she drew up charts on a piece of scrap wood, tracking the temperature and appetite of each animal. She was methodical, tireless. The color of her dress had faded, stained with mud and herbal remedies, but the steel in her spine remained. They had saved 3 of the mares. They were still weak, but they were eating, their eyes brighter. Titan, however, remained on the edge, a great, dark mountain of an animal trembling on the precipice of life and death. The blizzard was a catastrophic setback. It tore a section of roof from the barn, dumping snow and freezing wind into the main stalls. Feed supplies, already critically low, were now threatened by the moisture. For 2 days they were trapped, the world reduced to the howling wind and the suffocating whiteness outside the cabin door. On the 3rd day, the wind died down, leaving behind a world transformed and buried. A letter had been wedged into the door jamb, left by Henderson on his way through before the worst of the storm hit. It was from the bank. Gunnar's hands, calloused and thick, fumbled with the envelope. The formal, looping script inside was a death sentence. The bank was calling in his loan. Citing his precarious financial state, they were foreclosing. They would send a man to take possession of the property in 1 month. 1 month. 30 days until everything his father had built, everything he had fought to save, would be stripped away. The paper trembled in his hand. All their work, all the sleepless nights and back-breaking labor, had been for nothing. The flicker of hope Leeway had ignited within him was extinguished, plunged into an icy darkness that felt colder than the blizzard itself. He looked over at her, where she was carefully measuring out a dose of medicine for Titan. Her focus was absolute, her expression serene. She was still fighting a battle he now knew was already lost. The futility of it all crashed down on him, a suffocating wave of despair. The carefully constructed dam of his composure broke. He slammed the letter down on the rough-hewn table, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. "It's over," he said, his voice a raw, broken thing. "It's all for nothing." Li Wei looked up from her work, her eyes calm, questioning. She glanced at the letter, then back at his face, reading the defeat etched there. "What is it?" she asked. He laughed, a bitter, humorless sound that tore from his throat. "The bank. They're taking it all. The ranch, the horses, everything. In a month." He sank onto a stool, his huge shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He buried his face in his hands. "I've failed. I've lost it all." For a moment she said nothing. He expected pity, perhaps a quiet word of sympathy. He did not expect the sharp, cutting edge of her voice when she finally spoke. "So you will sit here and wait for them to come?" There was no softness in her tone, only a cold, hard challenge. He looked up, stunned by her lack of compassion. "What else is there to do? It's done. Can't you see that? We can save every horse in that barn and it won't make a difference. The paper is signed." "The paper is a problem to be solved," she countered, standing up and walking toward him. She stopped a few feet away, her small frame radiating an intensity that made him feel like the weaker one. "The horses are the reason to solve it. You give up. I do not." Her words struck him like a physical blow. All the frustration, the fear, the shame of his failure boiled over into a hot, blinding rage. "You don't understand anything," he roared, surging to his feet, his size making the small cabin feel even more constricting. "You come here with your herbs and your needles, thinking you can fix everything. This isn't a sick horse. This is a bank. They don't care about willow bark or clean water. They care about money, which I don't have." "Then we find a way to show them the money will come," she said, her voice still infuriatingly level. "The horses are getting stronger. They are assets. Their value is increasing because of our work." "Their value is zero if the bank owns them," he shouted, pacing the floor like a caged bear. "Why are you even still here? This isn't your fight. You came here for a husband and a home, and you've got a bankrupt fool and a pile of debt. You should have left when you had the chance." A flicker of something, hurt perhaps, crossed her face, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that formidable resolve. "I made a bargain," she said quietly. "I am not one to break it. But I did not bargain to partner with a coward." The word hung in the air between them, sharp and deadly. Coward. No one had ever called him that. He stopped his pacing and stared at her, his chest heaving. The emotional fracture was complete, a chasm of his despair and her refusal to surrender opening between them. A tense, wounded silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant, mournful cry of the wind. He did not speak to her for 2 days. They worked in a heavy, suffocating silence, the air between them thick with unspoken resentment. He performed his tasks with a grim, mechanical efficiency, his mind a maelstrom of shame and anger. The word coward echoed in his thoughts, relentless and accusatory. He found it was not her anger that wounded him most, but the truth he saw in it. He had been ready to surrender. On the third morning, as a weak, watery sun cast long blue shadows across the snow, she approached him in the barn. She was holding a ledger, one he hadn't seen before, and a sharpened piece of charcoal. She placed the book on a clean barrelhead between them. "We do not have a month," she said, her voice neutral, as if their argument had never happened. "The man from the bank will come sooner if he thinks the assets are not being protected. We must go to him." Gunnar stared at the ledger. "Go to him? With what? An empty hat in my hands?" "No," she said, tapping the cover of the book. "With a plan." She opened it. Inside, in neat, precise columns, she had documented everything. The cost of the feed, the estimated value of each horse before the sickness, and a projected value upon their full recovery. She had detailed her treatments, the cost of the herbs she'd gathered versus expensive town remedies, and a meticulous schedule for breeding the mares in the spring. It was a document of startling foresight and business acumen. It transformed his dying herd from a collection of sick animals into a portfolio of recovering assets. Titan is a fine stud, she continued, her finger tracing a line of figures. His foals will be strong. We can sell 2 by next autumn. That will cover more than half the debt. She outlined a strategy that was both audacious and logical, a path through an impossible situation that he had been utterly blind to. It was a final, desperate gamble, resting not on brawn or hope, but on cold, hard numbers and a woman's unyielding belief in them. He looked from the ledger to her face. The fight had not broken her. It seemed only to have focused her. He saw the truth then. His despair was a luxury, a self-indulgence she had neither the time nor the inclination for. She was a survivor, and she was offering to drag him toward survival with her. "They'll laugh me out of the building," he said, the words heavy with years of ingrained doubt. "You will not go alone," she stated simply. She closed the ledger and held it out to him. The choice was his. Surrender to the silence and the snow, or take this one last, improbable chance she was offering. His hand, large and trembling slightly, reached out and took the book. The journey to town was arduous, a full day's ride through snow-clogged passes. He rode his most reliable gelding, while Li Wei, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket he had given her, rode another. They spoke little, the crunch of hooves on snow the primary sound. But the silence was different now. It was not the silence of anger, but of shared purpose, of a fragile truce before a decisive battle. The bank was a stern brick building that seemed to radiate a coldness all its own. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of paper, ink, and money. The banker, a man named Mr. Davies, was small and severe, with spectacles perched on a narrow nose and a face that looked as though it had never countenanced a smile. He looked at Gunner's formidable size and rough appearance with open disdain, his eyes dismissing him before he had even spoken a word. "I believe our letter was quite clear, sir," Davies began, his voice dry as dust. "The matter is settled." Gunner felt the familiar wave of intimidation and hopelessness begin to rise. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. It was then that Li Wei stepped forward. She placed the ledger on the polished surface of Davies' desk. "You are mistaken," she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet office. "The matter is not settled. It is under new management." Davies blinked, his gaze shifting to this unexpected woman. He looked from her determined face to the worn cover of the ledger, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "And you are?" "I am his partner," Li Wei said, the word landing with quiet authority. "Open the book." With a huff of impatience, Davies opened the ledger. He scanned the first page, his expression skeptical. Then he turned to the second, and his condescending demeanor began to falter. He slowly turned page after page, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly as he took in the meticulous records, the cost analysis, the profit projections. He saw not the ramblings of a desperate farmer, but a sound, logical business proposal. Li Wei spoke as he read, her voice calm and confident, explaining the recovery rates, the breeding strategy for Titan, the projected income from foal sales. Gunner stood in silence, witnessing a battle fought not with fists or fury, but with logic and foresight. She was dismantling the banker's assumptions one by one, replacing his narrative of failure with her own narrative of recovery and potential. When she finished, Davies was silent for a long time. He looked from the ledger to Li Wei and then to Gunner, seeing him for the first time not as a liability, but as the man standing next to this formidable woman. "This is thorough," Davies conceded, the word tasting like a concession of defeat. "However, projections are not guarantees." "No," Li Wei agreed. "They are commitments. Grant us an extension until the end of summer. If we have not made the first payment from the sale of the foals by then, the property is yours, uncontested. It was a bold offer, a final wager. Davies considered it, tapping a long finger on his desk. He looked at the numbers again, then at her unwavering gaze. "Very well," he said at last, a grudging respect in his voice. "An extension, but not a day longer." The external victory was secured. Walking out of the bank and into the cold, bright sunlight, Gunnar felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. He looked at Leeway, walking beside him, her expression as serene as ever. That night, back in the cabin, the tension of the past weeks finally broke. They sat before the fire, the ledger on the table between them like a treaty. "I never could have done that," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "He would have eaten me alive." "He is just a man with a book of numbers," she replied. "We simply gave him a better book." He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face illuminated by the firelight. The chasm between them had closed. "I was wrong," he said, the admission costing him a great deal of his stubborn pride. "What you said about being a coward, you were right. I was ready to quit." She turned her head to look at him fully, her dark eyes searching his. "Fear is not cowardice," she said softly. "Surrender is." He reached across the space between them, his large, rough hand gently taking hers. Her fingers were small but strong, and they curled around his. "I thought I was getting a wife," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "I got a partner, a much better bargain." A small, rare smile touched her lips. "The bargain is not yet complete." With the threat of foreclosure lifted, a new energy infused their work. The harsh winter began to relent, its grip slowly loosening on the valley. The days grew longer, the sunlight holding a promise of warmth, and the great blanket of snow began to retreat, revealing the sleeping earth beneath. The thaw was happening both outside and within the small cabin. The silence between Gunnar and Leeway was now comfortable, filled with the easy rhythm of shared labor and mutual reliance. He found himself watching her constantly, not just with respect for her skills, but with a growing, tender affection. He learned the meaning of her silences, the subtle shifts in her expression. He brought her a cluster of early mountain crocuses he found pushing through the snow near the creek, and the quiet, genuine smile she gave him in return felt more valuable than any banknote. Their focus remained on the horses, but their goal was no longer just survival. It was about building a future. Titan made a full recovery, his strength returning day by day until he was once again the proud, powerful stallion he was meant to be. Under Leeway's guidance, he was bred with the healthiest mares, securing the next generation and the fulfillment of the plan she had laid out in her ledger. Their partnership deepened in the crucible of daily life. He taught her how to mend the split-rail fences, his large hands guiding her smaller ones. She, in turn, showed him how to identify the wild herbs that grew on the sunnier slopes, explaining their properties with a knowledge that seemed ancient and profound. Their conversations, once clipped and practical, now meandered into their pasts. He spoke of his father, of the dreams he'd had for this land before grief and debt had soured them. She spoke of her home, a world away, of a family of scholars and physicians, and of the circumstances that had led her to answer a stranger's advertisement for a wife. She had sought not a husband, but an escape, a chance to build something of her own, away from the rigid expectations of her family. The romance between them was not a fire, but a slow, steadily growing warmth, like an ember nursed carefully into a flame. It was in the way he began to save the best cuts of meat for her, the way she mended a tear in his coat before he even noticed it. The culmination of their slow-burn connection came not with a dramatic declaration, but in a moment of quiet completion. They were standing in the corral one evening, watching the new foals, shaky-legged and full of life, nuzzling against their mothers. The setting sun painted the peaks in hues of orange and pink, a color that reminded him of the dress she had worn on her first day. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You saved them. You saved all of this." Li Wei looked from the horses to him, her expression soft in the fading light. "We did it," she corrected gently. He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "Li Wei," he began, the name feeling more significant than ever before. "The bargain is not complete. You said it yourself. What will it take to complete it?" She held his gaze, her dark eyes reflecting the last light of the day. "A true partnership is not a bargain that ends," she said. "It is a promise that continues." He needed no further words. He leaned down and kissed her, a gesture of profound gratitude, respect, and a love that had been forged in the harshest of winters and earned through shared struggle. It was a quiet, certain beginning. 5 years later, the ranch was unrecognizable. The sagging barn roof was repaired and reinforced, the cabin had a new porch, and the fences were strong and straight, enclosing lush pastures where a herd of more than 20 healthy horses grazed. The Gunner brand was becoming known throughout the territory for producing strong, intelligent animals, and the profits had long since cleared the debt with the bank. Mr. Davies now greeted Gunner with a respectful nod whenever he came to town. The seasons had turned, and the brutal winter of their meeting was now a story they told, a foundational myth of their life together. Spring was a time of foaling and planting a large garden Li Wei had designed, its bounty preserving them through the winters. Summer was for training the young horses and haying the fields, the air thick with the scent of cut grass and warm earth. Autumn was for selling the yearlings and preparing for the cold, their stores full, their minds at ease. Winter was no longer a predator, but a time of rest, of quiet evenings by the fire, reading books she had ordered from the city, his head in her lap. Gunner was a changed man. The wildness was still there in his long hair and beard, but the desperation in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, steady calm. The weight of the world was no longer his alone to carry. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his own strengths, but also the immense value of his partner. Li Wei had changed too. She still wore her hair pulled back, but often with a soft tendril escaping. She wore practical buckskin trousers and sturdy boots for her work, but on special occasions, a trip to town or a quiet anniversary celebrated by themselves, she would sometimes wear the pink dress, now carefully mended. It was a reminder, a touchstone for them both of how far they had come, of the profound misjudgment that had led to his salvation. Their partnership was the bedrock of it all. It was in the seamless way they moved around each other in the barn, anticipating each other's needs without a word. It was in the late-night discussions over her ledgers, planning the future, their minds working as one. The love between them was as solid and enduring as the mountains that cradled their home. One late summer afternoon they stood on a ridge overlooking their valley. The sun was warm on their faces, and a gentle breeze stirred the pines. Below them, the ranch was a picture of prosperity and peace. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Your old life?" She was quiet for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the land that was now hers as much as his. "I miss my family," she said honestly, "but that was a life chosen for me. This," she squeezed his hand, "is a life we built." He looked at her, his heart full. The woman he had once seen as a fragile, foolish mistake was the architect of his entire world. He had sent for a wife, a helper, in an act of desperation. He had received a leader, a savior, and the love of his life. Their legacy was not just in the land or the herd, but in the quiet, powerful testament to the fact that sometimes the thing you think you want is nothing compared to the thing you truly need. The sun began to dip below the peaks, setting the sky ablaze. They stood together, watching the light fade, two small figures who had stood against the storm and built a new world in its wake.